Everyone called me crazy for living under the snow, tucked away in my little earth home up in the Bitterroot Mountains. They worried. They even laughed. But as the storm of the century crashed down, burying my house under 10 feet of snow and ice, cutting off every single line to the outside world, their warnings faded. My strange choice wasn't so crazy anymore. It was my only hope. Before I continue, drop a comment telling me where you're listening to this from. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. You won't want to miss the ending. The morning started with that quiet, almost magical hush you only get in the mountains right before a big snow. I was stirring a little pot of oatmeal, the scent of cinnamon and apples warming the small kitchen of my earth-sheltered home. My walls, made of packed earth and stone, always kept a steady, cool temperature, but with the wood stove purring in the corner, it felt like the coziest spot on earth. I watched the flakes start to drift past my big, south-facing window, each one a tiny, perfect star. I just smiled, thinking, "Here it comes, Elara, your winter cocoon." Old Man Hemlock, who lived down the valley, always shook his head at my house, calling it a fancy hobbit hole. But I loved how it nestled into the hillside, almost invisible under a blanket of white. By lunchtime, the flakes weren't drifting anymore. They were a thick, furious curtain. The wind had picked up, howling like a hungry wolf, making the heavy timbers of my roof groan in protest. I'd stocked up on firewood, enough for a good long spell, and my pantry was full of jars I'd canned myself. Peaches, green beans, tomatoes. I wasn't worried, not really. This house was built for snow, designed to be covered, to let the earth and snow be its blanket. I even had a few extra propane tanks for the kitchen stove, just in case. I remember Martha, my friend from town, telling me I was taking my cozy a bit too far. She worried about me being alone up here. I just laughed it off, told her I had good books and plenty of tea. But then, the world outside my window started to vanish. Not just covered, but swallowed. The snow began piling up against the glass. Not just a gentle drift, but a solid, pressing wall. The light in my living room, usually so bright even on a cloudy day, dimmed to a gray twilight. I walked over to the window, pressing my palm against the cold pane. The glass felt like a thin barrier, barely holding back the relentless force of the storm. I could feel the vibrations of the wind through the glass, a deep, rumbling shudder. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed from outside, followed by a heavy thud that shook the very foundation of my home. My little ceramic bird figurines on the mantelpiece rattled, and a framed photograph of my grandmother, Solveig, tilted precariously. Then, the hum of the refrigerator died. The light from my single lamps flickered and winked out, plunging the room into near darkness. My heart gave a little thump against my ribs. Power out. That wasn't unusual in a heavy storm, but the way it went felt different, more violent. I tried my landline, nothing but dead air. My cell phone, tucked away in its charging cradle, had no signal. A shiver, not from cold, traced its way down my spine. The world had gone silent, except for the insistent roar of the wind and the soft thump, thump, thump of snow piling against the side of the house. I tried to push open the heavy oak door that led outside, but it wouldn't budge. The snow had already piled up against it, a solid, unyielding barrier. My little home, my safe haven, suddenly felt like a tomb. I was cut off, completely and utterly alone, as the last sliver of daylight faded, painting the buried window a deep, inky black. I realized my cozy cocoon had become a cold, dark shell, with no way out, and no way in for anyone to reach me. And the night, a long, endless night, was just beginning, with no real shelter from the terrifying cold pressing in from every side. The silence after the power died was deafening, broken only by the shriek of the wind outside, a wild, hungry sound, that seemed to press against the very bones of my house. The air, which had been so cozy just hours before, now carried a sharp, biting edge. I wrapped my thickest shawl tighter around me, my fingers already feeling stiff. My small wood stove, usually a cheerful companion, felt like a tiny beacon against a vast, growing cold. I knew I couldn't just keep feeding it logs without thought. Every piece of firewood was precious now. A memory of my grandmother, Solveig, flickered through my mind. "When the cold truly bites, Elara," she used to say, her accent thick like the dark earth, "you make your world smaller. You shrink the space, and you hold the warmth close." That was it. I needed to build a shelter inside my shelter. A smaller, warmer nest. My hands, though a little shaky, moved with purpose. I dragged my old armchair and a sturdy wooden chest from the living room, pulling them close to the wood stove. The floor felt icy under my slippers, and I could feel a faint dampness rising from the packed earth walls, bringing with it that deep, earthy smell I usually found comforting, but which now felt like a cold breath. I found an old canvas tarp I used for painting projects and stretched it over the armchair and chest, creating a low, tent-like ceiling. It wasn't pretty, but it was something. Then came the blankets. I pulled out every quilt, every thick wool blanket I owned from the linen closet, their familiar smells of lavender and old cotton a small comfort. I draped them over the tarp, tucking them in to create thick, insulating layers. My fingers were clumsy, fumbling with the heavy fabric, but I pushed through, my breath puffing out in white clouds in the dim light of my battery-powered lantern. I even pulled out a few pieces of bark I'd collected for fire starting, thick, curled pieces of pine, and wedged them into a small gap near the floor, where I felt a sneaky draft slipping in. The rough texture of the bark felt strangely solid under my trembling fingers. It wasn't much, but it was a barrier, a little extra something against the creeping cold. Finally, I piled up pillows and cushions on the floor beneath my makeshift tent, creating a soft bed. It was a tight squeeze, barely big enough for me and a small stack of books. As I crawled inside, pulling the heavy blankets closed behind me, the air felt noticeably warmer, trapped, and held close. I could still hear the frantic roar of the storm outside my thick walls, a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated through the very ground. But inside my little cocoon, it was muffled, distant. I lay there, curled up tight, listening to the wind rage, feeling the small warmth I'd managed to create. My eyes burned with exhaustion, but sleep wouldn't come. Each gust of wind, each new shudder of the house, pulled me back from the edge of slumber. I was safe, for now, in my tiny, warm pocket, but the storm was only growing stronger, and with every passing minute, the world outside was burying me deeper and deeper. The next morning, the cold wasn't just creeping. It was a hungry beast gnawing at the edges of my little blanket fort. My breath hung in the air like faint smoke, even inside my carefully constructed nest. I peeled back the heavy quilts, the fabric stiff with the cold, and crawled out. The air in the main room bit at my nose and ears, a sharp, clean chill that made my skin prickle. My little wood stove, usually a steady heart, was barely flickering, the last log reduced to a handful of glowing embers. I shivered, watching the last of its warmth slowly vanish. A quick check of the woodpile beside the stove sent a fresh wave of panic through me. Only 3 small logs remained. 3 logs for an entire day and another night of this brutal cold. My large woodshed, usually brimming, was outside, and I knew it was buried deep under the storm's relentless fury. My stomach growled, a hollow, echoing sound in the quiet house. Food, fuel, 2 battles I had to fight today. I lit one of my battery-powered lanterns, its weak glow casting long dancing shadows on the packed earth walls. My pantry, usually a cheerful display of colorful jars, looked strangely muted in the dim light. I started taking stock, my fingers numb as I handled the cold glass. Jars of peaches, green beans, some stewed tomatoes, a few bags of dried pasta and rice. But what about something warm? Something substantial that didn't need a lot of cooking. I found a small bag of dried lentils, a forgotten treasure, and a few old potatoes that felt soft and sprouting in their bin. Not ideal, but sustenance. The thought of a warm meal, a truly warm meal, felt like a distant luxury. My biggest worry, though, was the wood. I had to get to the woodshed. I pulled on every layer I owned. Thick wool socks, heavy boots, my warmest corduroy pants, a couple of sweaters, and my old scratchy wool coat that smelled faintly of campfire smoke. I grabbed my small, flimsy shovel, the kind I usually used for gardening, and tried the main door again. It was still sealed shut, a solid wall of ice and snow. I pressed my ear against it, hearing only the distant, mournful keen of the wind, a sound that seemed to suck the warmth right out of the room. There was a smaller, less used side door, mostly a storage entrance, that led to a narrow path towards the woodshed. I pushed against it, grunting with effort. It gave way with a groan, letting in a blast of icy air that stole my breath. Outside, the world was a blinding, pristine white. Snow, deep and unbroken, stretched as far as I could see, sculpted into monstrous drifts by the wind. My woodshed, usually a sturdy brown rectangle, was a mere hump, almost completely swallowed. I started to dig, each scoop of snow a heavy, back-breaking effort. The cold instantly numbed my gloved hands, seeping through the fabric. The snow was dense, icy, and incredibly heavy. Not light and fluffy like the first flakes. It felt like trying to shovel concrete. My lungs burned, and my muscles screamed in protest. I cleared a small path, barely wide enough for me, the shovel scraping against hidden ice patches. My old bones ached with every movement, and a dull pain started in my lower back. I had to stop every few minutes, leaning on the shovel, gasping for air, watching my breath plume into the frozen air. The silence, broken only by my ragged breathing and the distant howl, was almost as oppressive as the weight of the snow. After what felt like hours, I finally uncovered the small wooden door of the woodshed. My fingers were stiff and clumsy as I wrestled with the frozen latch. It creaked open, revealing stacks of neatly cut logs, dry and promising. I grabbed as many as I could carry, burying my face in the rough bark for a moment, inhaling the comforting scent of pine and cedar. It was a small triumph, a battle won. But as I trudged back to the house, the weight of the logs pressing down on me, I realized something else. My single propane tank, the one that ran my small kitchen stove, made a hollow, disheartening sound when I shook it. It was almost empty. The few logs I'd managed to haul inside would last me through the night, maybe if I was extremely careful. But by morning, I'd be facing a new, terrifying reality. No way to cook, no way to melt snow for water, and the bitter cold would seep into my very bones. The cold had really settled in by morning, a deep, pervasive chill that felt like it was leaching the warmth from my very bones. My meager supply of logs from the woodshed had burned down to fine ash, leaving the wood stove cold and silent. I hugged myself, trying to rub some warmth back into my arms, but it felt like chasing ghosts. The air in my little blanket fort was barely warmer than the main room, and the thought of a hot cup of tea or a warm meal felt like a memory from another lifetime. My stomach grumbled again, a low, unhappy rumble. My single propane tank for the kitchen stove was definitely empty now. I'd given it a desperate shake just to be sure, and the hollow echo was like a final, mocking laugh. No way to cook, no way to even heat a little snow for drinking water. My throat felt dry and scratchy already. I knew I had to get more wood. It was the only way to fight off the creeping numbness that was starting to take hold in my fingers and toes. I layered up again, pulling on every last scrap of warm clothing, my movements stiff and sluggish. The boots felt like lead weights on my feet. I grabbed my gardening shovel, the thin, flimsy one that was really no match for the dense, icy snow, and headed for the side door. The path I'd dug yesterday was already half filled in, the snow blowing back in fine and powdery. The wind wasn't quite as furious today, but it still carried an Arctic bite, stinging my exposed cheeks. I started to dig again, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The snow was even harder today, packed down by the wind and already starting to freeze solid. My shovel scraped against what felt like solid ice beneath the fresh powder. My arms ached, and my back protested with every scoop. I had to reach the woodshed to get enough logs not just for heat, but to melt some snow for water. The thirst was starting to become a constant, nagging presence. I pushed the shovel into a particularly stubborn drift, leaning my full weight into it. My boot hit a hidden patch of slick ice, completely invisible under a dusting of fresh snow. My foot shot out from under me, and I twisted, a sickening, sharp crack echoing in the sudden silence of the white world. A searing pain shot through my left ankle, hot and immediate, making me cry out. A raw, choked sound swallowed by the vast emptiness around me. I went down hard, landing heavily on my side in the snow, the shovel flying from my numb fingers. For a moment I just lay there, breathless, the sharp, fiery pain radiating up my leg. Tears pricked at my eyes, not just from the pain, but from the stark, awful realization of what had just happened. My ankle throbbed, a relentless, pounding ache. I tried to push myself up, but a fresh wave of agony made me gasp and collapse back into the snow. Panic, cold and sharp as the wind clawed at my throat. How could I get back? How could I walk? How could I even get more wood now? I forced myself to breathe, slow and deep, just like Solveig, my grandmother, had taught me. Panic only makes the cold colder, Elara. Think. Always think. My hands, though shaking, felt around in the snow for the shovel. It was just out of reach. I gritted my teeth, carefully pushing myself up onto my right knee, the injured ankle screaming in protest. I reached, stretching my arm as far as it would go, and finally my fingertips brushed against the cold metal. I pulled it towards me, using it as a clumsy crutch, dragging my left leg behind me through the snow, each movement a fresh agony. It took what felt like an eternity to hobble the short distance back to the side door. My body was trembling, slick with sweat under my layers, despite the freezing air. I crawled through the narrow opening, collapsing just inside my home, the blessed warmth of the interior a distant comfort against the fire in my ankle. I dragged myself over to my blanket fort, my breath coming in painful gasps. I managed to untie one of my thick wool scarves, wrapping it tightly around my swollen ankle, trying to give it some support. It was a crude bandage, but it was all I had. I was back inside, safe from the immediate danger. But my body was screaming, and the wood stove was still cold. Now, with a throbbing ankle and the last bit of firewood already burned, I lay in the dim, freezing silence, knowing the real fight for warmth and water had only just begun, and I was facing it alone, with one leg. The pain in my ankle was a hot, insistent drumbeat, throbbing through me even as I lay huddled in my blanket fort. My teeth chattered, and a deep shiver ran through my whole body. The cold had found its way into every corner of the house, clinging to the air, seeping into the very fabric of my clothes. The thought of getting up, of trying to hobble to the woodshed again, felt utterly impossible. Despair, a heavy, suffocating blanket, started to settle over me. No heat, no water, no way out. I felt utterly trapped, alone in the dark. Then a whisper, faint as the rustle of dry leaves, brushed against the edges of my mind. It was Solveig, my grandmother, her voice raspy with age and a lifetime of harsh winters. I closed my eyes, and suddenly I wasn't in my cold, buried home anymore. I was a little girl again, maybe 7 or 8, standing beside her in a small, hushed forest in Norway. The air was crisp, so cold it made my nose tingle, and the snow lay thick and undisturbed, shimmering like countless tiny diamonds. Solveig, her face etched with wrinkles that seemed to hold stories, her thick wool scarf pulled high around her chin, pointed with a mittened hand. "See, little bird," she'd say, her breath puffing out in white clouds. "Snow is not just a blanket. It is a building stone. You learn to read it, and it will keep you safe." Her gloved fingers, thick and strong, would brush against the top layer of snow, then dig deeper. "This, light and fluffy, is a whisper. It drifts, but down here," she'd push through to a denser layer. "This is packed tight by the wind. This is strong. You can make a wall with this, or a roof." I remembered her showing me how the wind shaped drifts, creating natural curves and overhangs. "The wind," she'd explain, her eyes bright. "It piles the snow where it wants to make shelter for the animals. We can learn from it." She'd then pull out a small, sturdy shovel, not much bigger than my own flimsy gardening tool, and start to dig, not through the snow, but into it, creating a hollow, a small dark tunnel. The air inside the growing space was always surprisingly still, noticeably warmer than the biting wind outside. The smell of cold earth and damp snow would fill the air, a strangely comforting scent. "When you are lost, when the cold bites worst," she'd tell me, her voice low and steady, "you don't fight the snow. You make it your friend. You make a small hole, Elara, not deep, not wide, just enough for your body. The snow itself will keep the warmth you make, and if you need to travel and the snow is too deep, you make a passage, a tunnel, slowly, carefully. Let the snow do the work of sheltering you." I could almost feel the rough wool of her coat against my cheek, hear the crunch of her boots on the hard-packed snow. My eyes snapped open, the memory sharp and vivid, like a sudden burst of sunlight. My grandmother wasn't just telling me about survival. She was handing me a tool, a way forward. I couldn't walk over the snow to the woodshed, not with my ankle, but I could tunnel through it. The woodshed was only a few yards from the side door, buried under a deep drift, but it wasn't an insurmountable distance if I went under the surface. And since you've made it this far, go ahead and hit that like button. It really helps me keep bringing stories like this. The thought, even with my throbbing ankle, brought a strange spark of energy. It wouldn't be easy, not with one good leg and a flimsy shovel, but it wasn't impossible anymore. The cold, dense snow, the very thing that trapped me, could also be my path. It was a slow, painful process just getting myself out of the fort and to the side door. I grabbed my little gardening shovel again, the metal cold and biting against my fingers. I could feel Solveig's presence, a strong, quiet comfort, as if her hand was resting on my shoulder. She was with me, not just in my memory, but in the knowledge she'd placed in my heart. But as I looked at the solid wall of white that stood between me and the precious wood, a new daunting challenge presented itself. How could I, alone and injured, dig a tunnel strong enough not to collapse on me, while also keeping enough strength to carry back the logs I so desperately needed? The throbbing in my ankle was a constant, searing reminder of my foolishness. But Solveig's voice, quiet and strong, kept circling in my head. "Make the snow your friend, Elara." So, with my flimsy gardening shovel acting more like a clumsy extension of my arm than a tool, I began to chip and scrape at the dense, icy snow by the side door. My injured ankle screamed with every shift of my weight, forcing me to lean heavily on my good leg, using my hands to push aside the heavy chunks of snow I managed to dislodge. It was slow, agonizing work. I wasn't digging down, but into the drift that buried the path to my woodshed. The snow was packed so hard, a solid wall of white that felt like frozen concrete. My fingers, even inside my thick gloves, quickly became stiff and aching. I'd scrape a small amount of snow, push it back behind me into the house's entrance, then drag myself a few inches further. The air inside my growing tunnel was surprisingly still. A damp, earthy smell mixing with the sharp scent of cold snow. Each shovelful felt like moving a mountain, but the thought of the cold wood stove and the growing thirst pushed me onward. After what felt like an eternity, my shovel finally hit something hard and wooden, the woodshed door. A wave of pure, unadulterated relief washed over me, so strong it almost brought fresh tears to my eyes. I clawed at the snow, clearing a small opening, then squeezed my body through, my ankles screaming a fresh protest. Inside, the dry, rough logs were a sight for sore eyes. I grabbed 2, then 3, then 4 of the smaller, lighter pieces, cradling them like precious treasures, inhaling their comforting scent of pine and cedar. I painstakingly dragged them back, pulling them behind me through the narrow tunnel, my breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. Back inside, with the precious logs beside me, I slumped against the cold earth wall for a moment, letting the exhaustion wash over me. Then, with renewed purpose, I crawled to the wood stove, my fingers, clumsy and stiff, carefully arranged kindling and paper, then the small logs. With a trembling hand, I lit a match. The tiny flame flickered, then caught, licking greedily at the paper. A small puff of smoke, the dry crackle of wood, and then the blessed growing warmth. The smell of burning pine filled the cold air, a perfume of hope. I closed my eyes, just letting the heat wash over my face, easing the chill that had settled deep in my bones. With the stove now radiating a steady heat, my next task was water. I melted a pot of snow, watching the white crystals turn to clear liquid, steam rising in soft clouds. The first sip, cool and clean, was like drinking pure life. It was the most delicious thing I'd ever tasted, soothing my dry throat and washing away the grittiness in my mouth. My body, so parched and depleted, seemed to sigh with contentment. I then set about improving my little blanket fort. I found some flattened cardboard boxes I'd saved from deliveries, usually destined for recycling, and carefully tucked them between the layers of blankets and the tarp. The cardboard, stiff and dry, added an extra layer of insulation, making the walls of my small enclosure feel more solid, less flimsy. I even managed to find an old, thick wool rug I used to keep by the front door and dragged it, inch by painful inch, to lie it on the floor of my fort, creating a softer, warmer barrier against the cold earth. It wasn't perfect, but it felt secure, cozy. As I nestled back inside my upgraded fort, the wood stove humming a soft, continuous song, the air around me was finally, truly warm. The damp chill began to recede, replaced by a dry, comforting heat that felt like a hug. I could still hear the distant moan of the wind outside, a reminder of the storm that still raged, but it no longer felt threatening. Inside my small, warm world, with the scent of pine smoke in the air and a small pot of melted snow simmering gently on the stove, a strange feeling began to bloom in my chest. It wasn't happiness, not exactly, but a deep, quiet satisfaction, a sense of peace even. I was hurt, alone and trapped, but in this tiny space I had carved out of the wilderness, I was also, strangely, home. It was a kind of comfort I'd never known before, born not of ease but of sheer will and the wild, stubborn desire to survive. But as I finally allowed myself to relax, a chilling thought pricked through my newfound tranquility. The storm might be a friend to my home structure, but the snow was still a relentless enemy, burying me deeper with every passing hour. How long could my precious supplies truly last against such an unyielding siege? That night felt like 1,000 nights rolled into one, a dark, freezing tunnel with no end in sight. Even with the wood stove purring softly and my fortified blanket fort, the cold pressed in from every direction, a silent, relentless enemy. I could feel it through the earth walls, a deep, pervasive chill that seemed to hum in the very air. My ankle throbbed with a dull ache, a constant reminder of my clumsy fall. And every now and then, a shiver would ripple through me, a deep, bone-rattling cold that the fire couldn't quite banish. I had arranged my precious logs carefully, trying to stretch them out, feeding the stove just enough to keep the embers alive, but not enough to truly warm the whole room. Each time I opened the little door to toss in another piece of wood, the rush of cold air made me flinch. The scent of burning pine was comforting, a small anchor in the vast, dark quiet. But the dwindling pile of logs was a knot of dread in my stomach. I watched the flames dance, mesmerized, trying to draw warmth not just from the fire, but from the sight of it. Hours crawled by, each one heavier than the last. I tried to read, holding my little battery lantern close, but my eyes felt heavy, and the words blurred. My mind kept drifting to Martha, my friend in town. Was she worried? Did anyone even know I was out here, buried under all this snow? The thought of her warm kitchen, bustling with life, felt impossibly far away, like a dream. The loneliness settled in, heavy and cold, a different kind of chill. I missed the sound of another human voice, even Old Man Hemlock's grumbles. Around what I guessed was the middle of the night, the wind outside picked up again, a low, mournful howl that vibrated through the earth, making the very ground beneath me tremble. It sounded closer now, more aggressive, like a living thing trying to claw its way in. The fire in the stove, despite my careful tending, seemed to shrink, the embers glowing a duller red. I felt the heat recede, inch by agonizing inch, and the air inside my fort grew noticeably colder. My breath started to plume again, faint wisps in the dim light. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at me. I only had a few logs left, just enough for maybe another hour or two if I was extremely careful. My ankle was screaming, a fiery pain that made it almost impossible to shift position. I couldn't get more wood now, not in this darkness, not with this cold, not with the wind howling like that. What if the fire went out completely? What if the temperature inside my home dropped to dangerous levels? I pulled my heavy wool blanket tighter around my shoulders, trying to curl into an even smaller ball, to hold on to every last bit of my own body heat. I could feel the cold seeping into my joints, making them ache. My fingers and toes felt like numb blocks of ice. I thought of Solveig again, her firm voice telling me, "You make your own warmth, Elara. You remember the sun, even when it is hidden." I tried to focus on that, on the memory of sun on my face, but it was hard. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the dim glow of my lantern and the dying embers. My throat felt dry again, a constant thirst. Even though I had melted snow, it took so much fuel just to melt a little, and I knew I couldn't spare any more. The hours stretched, endless and terrifying. I watched the last log in the stove turn to ash, the tiny sparks winking out one by one until only a faint orange glow remained, quickly fading to black. The cold then truly sank its teeth in, no longer just biting but gnawing. My teeth chattered so violently I thought they might crack. I was shivering uncontrollably, my entire body trembling. I felt a desperate urge to get up, to move, to generate some heat. But the pain in my ankle was a fierce guardian, chaining me to my spot. I was so tired, so utterly exhausted, but I knew I couldn't give in to sleep, not in this cold. I had to stay awake, to fight. Just as I thought I couldn't bear another minute, a faint, almost imperceptible shift happened. The absolute blackness outside the buried window seemed to soften, turning from inky black to a deep, bruised purple. Then, ever so slowly, a faint, ghostly gray began to bleed into the edges of the window, a pale, anemic light that wasn't warmth, but was certainly the absence of utter darkness. The wind's howl seemed to recede, a tiny bit quieter, as if even the storm was weary. It was dawn, the first hint of morning, and somehow, impossibly, I was still alive. But with the arrival of that frail gray light, a new and terrifying reality settled over me. The storm had quieted, yes, but the bitter cold had only deepened, and my wood stove was now completely, utterly cold, with not a single log left. The bitter cold gnawed at me, a constant, painful companion that morning. My wood stove was a cold, dark tomb, and my fingers and toes felt like numb blocks of ice, even inside my carefully built blanket fort. My teeth chattered so hard my jaw ached, a frantic rhythm against the silence. I clung to Solveig's words like a lifeline. "You make your own warmth, Elara." But my own warmth felt like a distant ember, flickering weakly against the vast, encroaching chill. I tried to focus on my breathing, slow and steady, but exhaustion weighed me down, pulling at my eyelids like heavy stones. Suddenly, a low thrum vibrated through the packed earth beneath me. It wasn't the wind, not this time. It was deeper, a rhythmic beat that grew steadily louder, closer, shaking the very ground. My heart, which had been a frozen lump in my chest, lurched to life, pounding against my ribs. A mechanical whine, then another, unmistakable now. Snowmobiles. My mind, sluggish with cold and fatigue, struggled to grasp it. Could it be? After all this time, all this silence? I tried to shout, but my voice was a reedy whisper, barely escaping my dry throat. Pain shot through my ankle as I tried to pull myself out of the fort, a fiery protest that made me gasp. I dragged myself to the side door, where my painstakingly dug tunnel still offered a tiny, dark opening to the outside world, now partially filled with fresh powder. My ears strained, trying to catch the sounds which were growing more distinct. Muffled voices, like ghosts, speaking through thick walls. I couldn't make out the words, but they were human, alive. Hemlock said she was here. I heard a snippet, then another. Buried deep. My breath hitched in my chest. They were looking for me. Someone new. Martha. Old Man Hemlock. Then a scraping sound. Right above me, the unmistakable shoosh thump of a shovel biting into snow. My tunnel entrance, which had been just a dark, narrow slit, suddenly had a tiny pinprick of light appear in its darkness. It grew into a shaky rectangle as someone cleared snow from a vent I'd forgotten about, a small pipe meant to let fresh air in. I scrabbled at the snow with my good hand, trying to widen the opening. A face appeared, framed by a thick hood, a worried frown etched into Old Man Hemlock's craggy features. His eyes, usually squinting against the sun, were wide with concern. "Elara, you in there, girl?" he shouted, his voice rough but clear. Tears, hot and sudden, streamed down my frozen cheeks. Yes, I'm here." My voice cracked, but the sound, even to my own ears, was a melody of sheer relief. Relief so potent it made my knees buckle, flooded every inch of me, washing away the cold, the fear, the loneliness. I could hear more voices now, the insistent crunch of snow boots, the frantic digging. Then, another face, Martha's, her eyes wide with a mix of terror and profound, overwhelming relief. "Elara, oh my God, Elara!" she cried, her voice choked with emotion. But as their strong hands reached through the snow, pulling me towards the blinding, cold light of the outside world, I felt a new fear, cold and sharp, prickle at me. My hair was matted, My clothes stained with dirt and ash, my face streaked with tears and grime. My injured ankle was a swollen, angry mess, poking out from my tattered scarf. What would they see? The crazy lady who lived under the snow, broken and barely clinging to life, or the survivor who had battled the storm of the century? The thought hit me like another blast of Arctic air, even as their hands finally gripped mine, pulling me from the suffocating darkness into a world that felt both impossibly safe and utterly terrifying. Strong hands, warm with human touch, wrapped around my arms, pulling me up and out of the narrow tunnel. The light, even through the gray, snow-filled air, was blinding after days in the dimness. My injured ankle screamed in protest as my body was hoisted, but the pain was a distant echo against the sheer, overwhelming rush of fresh air and human voices. Martha was there, her face streaked with tears and concern, her hands fussing over my matted hair and grimy face. Old Man Hemlock, gruff as ever, just nodded, his eyes searching mine with a look that was surprisingly soft. "Elara, you old fool, we thought we'd lost you," Martha choked out, pulling me into a tight hug that squeezed the breath from my lungs. Her warmth, so foreign and comforting, made a fresh wave of tears prick at my eyes. I could smell her familiar scent of lavender and something sweet, like baking bread. The world spun for a moment, the vast white expanse of the mountains stretching out, unfamiliar and daunting now that I was exposed to it. My gaze, however, was drawn not to the anxious faces around me, but back to the entrance of my home. It was just a hole in the snow, a dark maw in the side of the drift. But it wasn't a tomb. It was the place that had held me, kept me safe, breathed with me through the storm. The packed earth walls and heavy timbers, hidden now under layers of snow, had been my shield. My wood stove, though cold now, had warmed me. My blanket fort, crude as it was, had been my sanctuary. They called me crazy for living under the snow, but it was the snow itself, and this strange, burrowed home that had cradled me through the worst. "We need to get you to town, Elara," Old Man Hemlock said, his voice cutting through my thoughts. "That ankle looks bad. Doctor needs to see it. Get you some real food. A warm bed." He gestured towards a couple of snowmobiles, their engines humming quietly, parked a little distance away. The thought of a doctor, of a clean bed, of a proper meal that didn't involve dried lentils and melted snow, sent a shiver of longing through me. My body ached in places I didn't know existed, and the cold was already seeping back into my bones, despite the layers of clothes. But then I looked around at the wild, untamed beauty of the mountains, still blanketed in a pristine, unbroken white. This was my home. This was the quiet, the solitude I had sought. This was where I had faced the storm and, against all odds, survived. Leaving felt like a retreat, a surrender. My hand instinctively went to the rough, cold edge of the snow tunnel, feeling the solid, unforgiving texture that had tested me, yet protected me. My home, my strange, buried house, had become more than just a place to live. It was a part of me, a testament to my own stubbornness and strength. It had held my secrets, my fears, and my small triumphs. I can't," I whispered, the words barely audible over the hum of the snowmobiles. Martha frowned, her eyes wide with confusion. "Can't what, Elara? You need help. You're hurt." My heart pounded, a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The mountain wind, now a gentle whisper, seemed to carry Solveig's voice, reminding me that I'd made the snow my friend. I looked at the dark opening of my house again, and then at the worried faces of my friends, waiting to take me away. The choice, suddenly, felt vast and impossibly heavy, a crossroads in the deep snow. Could I truly leave the very place that had saved me, even for the promise of warmth and healing? The crisp mountain air filled my lungs as Martha and Old Man Hemlock helped me back into my little earth home, my injured ankle protesting with every careful step. I refused to leave. This house, this quiet sanctuary had kept me safe, and I wasn't about to abandon it now. Martha, bless her worried heart, brought in a thermos of hot chicken noodle soup, its savory steam a heavenly perfume. The first spoonful, warm and rich, tasted like pure magic, a stark contrast to the bland, watery, melted snow I'd been living on. It was a warmth that spread from my tongue all the way to my chilled toes, chasing away the last lingering shivers. Old Man Hemlock, surprisingly gentle, splinted my ankle with some old pine branches and a roll of gauze from his first aid kit, grumbling softly about stubborn women the whole time. In the days that followed, as my ankle slowly mended and the snow began its slow retreat, I found myself looking at everything differently. Food, for instance. Before the storm, I'd stocked my pantry out of habit. A sensible precaution. Now every jar of peaches, every bag of lentils, every single potato was a profound blessing, a testament to life itself. I savored each bite, truly tasting the sweetness of the fruit, the earthiness of the vegetables, a gratitude so deep it brought tears to my eyes. I realized how casually I had consumed, never truly appreciating the journey from earth to plate. And warmth. Oh, the warmth. The simple flick of a lighter, the crackle of dry wood in the stove, the soft wool of a blanket. These were no longer just comforts. They were anchors, vital shields against a relentless, unforgiving world. I'd watch the flames dance, not just for their beauty, but for the tangible heat they offered, remembering the gnawing cold when the last log had burned. I started to understand that warmth wasn't just about temperature. It was about feeling safe, cared for, alive. But perhaps the biggest change was how I saw people and how I saw silence. Before, I cherished my solitude, my quiet life away from the hustle and bustle. The silence of the mountains was my friend, but the silence of true isolation, of being completely cut off, was a different beast entirely. It was heavy, oppressive, a constant reminder of how utterly alone I was. When Martha and Old Man Hemlock arrived, their voices, even Old Man Hemlock's usual grumbles, were the sweetest music I'd ever heard. I found myself longing for human connection, for a simple chat over coffee, for the sound of another person breathing nearby. I learned that while solitude can be a balm, true isolation can be a poison. My friends, whom I sometimes kept at a gentle distance, were now precious, vibrant threads in the tapestry of my life. I still loved my earth-sheltered home, perhaps even more fiercely now. It wasn't just a quirky house, it was a fortress, a wise choice that had kept me alive. But I also saw it with new eyes, not just as a refuge from the world, but a place that had shown me what I truly needed. In the world. The storm had stripped away everything superficial, leaving only the raw essentials: food, warmth, and the profound, undeniable need for connection. What I learned, tucked away under 10 feet of snow, was this: true survival isn't just about facing the wilderness outside. It's about discovering the boundless wilderness of strength and resilience that lies within us all, and the quiet, enduring power of a helping hand. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. Your support is what brings these stories to more people.